Welcome everyone to Boston JavaScript 2019 edition. We have a great talk today from James about CSS grids, and pretty excited about that. But before we get there, we want to say thanks to Spreadfast for hosting as always. Well, not always. Quick note that we will probably be relocating to another location in February. Right, Victor? Are you all right for February? Or?
We'll be around for February, but...
Okay, in April then. We'll do one last one. We'll do a blowout. We'll break all the things and go chairs. We don't have to.
Everyone's ready to drive up north once a month, right?
Yeah.
Yes! Sure.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
I think the most likely answer is the Indeed offices downtown, but I haven't actually gotten an official buy-in for that, but we'll have expect updates. And then our sponsors.
Our sponsors for tonight are Magento, which also happens to be my employer. Magento is also Adobe as of a few months ago. I gave the spiel the last time we did a talk, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet. If you do front end and you're interested in either new tech or really old tech, because we have a lot of products, go ahead and talk to me after, or if you want, you can reach out to me on Twitter, DrewML, if you're not with the face-to-face type. Cool, thanks everyone.
Awesome, thanks Magento for the pizza and beer. So the way things work here is we will have a talk from James for a while, and then we'll do some Q&A, and depending on how much time we have left, we might take a break and go hit the restroom, grab another drink, and then continue Q&A or just have general discussion about stuff going on the web. And then afterward, we'll hike over to the Lavaca Street Bar, those who want to go, and we'll hang out there for the rest of the evening. And before we do anything else, I want to talk about our code of conduct. This is just a formalization of the nice culture that we've had at Austin JavaScript. We've been really lucky to have really, really nice people that have created a very safe place, and we want to keep it that way. So our meetup is dedicated to providing a harassment-free meetup experience for everyone regardless of gender, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, or religion. We do not tolerate harassment of meetup participants in any form. Sexual language and imagery is not appropriate for any meetup venue, including talks, workshops, parties, Twitter, and other online media. Meetup participants violating these rules may be sanctioned or expelled from the meetup without refund at the discretion of the meetup organizers. And so, if someone's making you feel uncomfortable or unsafe, please reach out to me, I'm Lon, or Andrew. You can also reach us on our Slack, and on the Code of Conduct page, you can reach us via email and Twitter. So, with no further ado, James, you ready?
Yeah. Yeah? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Intro round of applause for James.
All right. Thank you so much. That's it. All right. No, thank you to the organizers, Spreadfast, Magento. I really appreciate being here today. And today I'm going to talk about saving CSS grid headaches with JavaScript. Anybody heard of JavaScript before? Yeah? No? A little bit about myself. I'm the life of parties. My small talk topics include React, Google Lighthouse, CSS and JavaScript. Hopefully this is the last time I'm talking about grid because I've talked a lot about grid in my career already. And then I really expected for the most important and most popular side project I've ever done to be a stupid meme website about Texas football. If you haven't seen it, it's texasfootballback.com. Has had a major update since the last bowl. Spoiler alert, we're back, but there's a little bit extra if you go. So when I actually applied to speak for this great meetup, I was actually employed at IBM Design, worked there for 3 years, had a lot of fun, worked on some really weird things, and then I got to join Pingboard right after the November meetup where we got to see Marie speak, and ever since I've been on just this focused product. If you don't know, Pingboard is org chart software where stakeholders at the company create and plan org chart together, and then they can actually publish it to the rest of their company to see and find who is in charge of what and who reports to who. And it's really helpful. I honestly, while I was at IBM, I wish we had Pingboard as a product. So I actually, in November, submitted the idea for this talk. And then afterwards, I quickly forgot about submitting the idea for this talk. And then last week, a coworker shared this meetup with everyone. I was like, hey, we should go to this meetup. And I had the question, am I speaking at this? Turns out I am, and I'm here today, and I promise I didn't last minute all of this. I wasted a Sunday on it. So yeah, fast forward today, I'm here. I am prepared, and we're going to talk about CSS Grid. What ended up happening, this is going to be a two-parter. So either you're going to get 2 for the price of 1 in talks, or they're going to at least be half effort each, so you get a whole worth of talk. We're going to talk about creating the tools that help you use CSS Grid using JavaScript. And then we're going to go into user land as a developer that uses one of these tools and figure out the best way to use it. So first, why did I get into Grid? Well, I was working for IBM Design Core. IBM Design supports thousands of designers across the 480,000 person company. And they said, hey, you're going to be working on new design system work for the company. Here's the IBM brand team. If you work at a large company, you know that these large companies have a completely separate team dedicated to the identity of their company. And IBM brand was located in New York City. And they worked really as like a agency put on special tasks really quickly. And usually it was like ad campaigns, maybe it was releasing a website, but they would work with outside agencies to actually make that website. And so what I really enjoyed about working with this team was they didn't really have much web development experience. There were no web developers on the team, and they weren't really used to the constraints of the web as a medium. What I loved in our interactions was we would go step by step through design system work, and they'd keep asking questions, I'd give an answer, keep asking questions. And they always asked, like, why is it this way? And sometimes they had good answers, but sometimes I was like, I don't know, it's not really the best for design. And so that came up a lot in Grid. And when we got to Grid, the more they talked about making a Grid framework for IBM, the more they kept describing CSS Grid. They didn't want the traditional float or flexbox grid framework where you just keep placing an item next to each other, keep placing an item next to each other, and then it goes to the next row. They wanted more than that. They wanted bi-directional grid. What CSS Grid, if you haven't explored it yet, does for you is it allows you to control sizes and positions both on the x-axis and y-axis at the same time. Flexbox is great and can let you control one of those axes, but you can't do both axes at once. So we were super excited. We were like, okay, well, let's release the first CSS grid framework for a design system. And we got pretty excited by all the green on caniuse.com. But then we zoom in a little bit, and we notice that there's some off greens in that chart. Specifically in old versions of Edge and IE, there's this faded green, and what that meant was partial support. What the history lesson is Microsoft was really eager to implement CSS Grid in their browsers. So much that they actually implemented a working draft of the CSS Grid spec before it was final. And so what they've implemented in those browsers is very different than the final spec that you should use today. The biggest barrier in that spec is you have to know the exact placement of every item you use in your DOM. CSS Grid lets you just not tell each item where it's going to go, and it has auto placement similar to Flexbox. And we went back to the product teams and we were like, hey, you don't really need to support IE11, do you? And the answer back we got was, yeah. And it turns out one of the biggest reasons, we actually heard a lot that a lot of Chinese users are still on IE for regulation reasons. And other companies will have analytical data and it says, hey, 10% of the world is still on IE11 for some reason for our customer base. So it's not something you can ignore yet. I mean, 5 years down the road, for sure, let's ignore it all we want. But just like every update with browsers, we get a time of transition. What's nice is now that people are transitioning off of IE, all the modern browsers really force auto-updating on users, so that does make our life pretty easy. But with the current problem, we needed to support IE11. What we did know about IE11 was that it supported Flexbox. So I kept coding the CSS grid version of the design specs I was given for a grid over and over again. And then once I had a good place there, I said, okay, well, what would the exact same design specs look like with a Flexbox grid code? And I had those, and I was like, well, great. Now I can give the products that don't need to support IE the CSS grid file, and the ones that do need to support IE, I can give them this Flexbox file. And even if the two products have a user flow that goes between them, I knew the pages would still look the same. What I ended up realizing after I made this was that we could really abstract away all the design decisions into a config file. And so that's where CSS Gridish came from. And I really appreciated all the immediate response people got from it. I think it really hit a high note to people about the idea that I could use modern technology and know that legacy browsers will at least fall back to something graceful. And so what would happen is if you didn't need to support IE11, you use the CSS grid file. It was called css-gridish.css. If you did need to support IE, you use the Flexbox file. It was called -legacy at the end. And what you were told was whenever you were ready to drop IE support, you could stop using this much larger sized Flexbox file and just replace it with the smaller CSS file using CSS grid and shave kilobytes and kilobytes off of your performance. So yeah, it had a really great initial response. And the way it worked was you make this JSON file with your config, and what we tried to do was we tried to turn it more into a design terminology JSON file. So instead of like saying what's the padding for this column, we say what's the gutter. Instead of saying what's the container size, what's the breakpoint. And this was all in an effort to have the designers actually make these spec grid files for developers. And they responded well to this. So we solved the idea that this original draft spec of CSS grid could be covered. We just avoided entirely, use Flexbox. And then also grid gap. So grid gap is a rule in CSS grid. It's very helpful if in your designs you never bleed color into those gutters. So, grid gap would be great if I never wanted to go into the in between columns here. But the design system we were working on at IBM, almost all of it had elements like touching each other. There was no white space in between. So grid gap didn't really help us that much. And so we thought, okay, well, really a developer will want the flexibility of whether or not they bleed or not. So what CSS Gridish actually did with class names was it auto-enforced padding, but then you could undo that padding whenever you needed to bleed halfway into a gutter. And feel free to stop me anytime. I think that'd be a lot better than you going through the whole presentation lost. And then finally, subgrid is really important. And I'm so happy for the sake of when this talk was. There was a great article that really got promoted this past week in the web dev community by Ken Bellows, Why We Need CSS Subgrid. Subgrid is a feature in CSS Grid that did not release with the initial final draft of CSS Grid. It's anticipated in the level 2 spec, which none of the browsers have in production to users yet. But it was really necessary on products. Right now, CSS Grid is in a state where it's really helpful for doing the initial layout on your page. But what subgrid allows you to do is you are able to pass down your grid row and column sizes down the DOM to the next divs embedded within each other. So you're able to do this today with CSS Grid we have. But you start coding your page, you say, hey, here's my header, here's my main content, here's my sidebar. And you're like, okay, great, that's my CSS Grid HTML right there. But then all of a sudden, when you get into the sidebar, say you're supposed to have 2 columns left, you don't know that once you go the divs inside of the sidebar don't know they have 2 columns left once you go inside. They think they may have like all of the 12 of the whole page again. And as a developer, you may say, well, yeah, but I'll just remember that later and never divide the sidebar by 3 spaces. But the honest truth is you don't. That's why CSS Grid is so helpful from a design system perspective if we had subgrid. So say the purple was your first layer of HTML, and then you start putting a bunch of divs within another one. Now you can see that everything's aligned perfectly no matter where it is in the DOM structure. And so CSS Gridish actually handled subgrids for you. Automatically, a div inside of a CSS Gridish grid would know how many columns were left in its space given. And we cheated to do this. I'll talk about how we cheated, but I want to point out that it got a great initial impact. It just like, it was viral for a week. But then I checked NPM this past week, and it's not that active. And it's really important to know your failures, but basically in the open source community, that was like, oh, that's nice, good job. Here's a star, but no downloads. And we cheated doing subgrid by using VW units. VW units are viewport width. So supposedly, 100 VWs is the full screen of the user's browser window. So that's how we were able to keep track of how many columns were left the deeper you went into your HTML. There were 2 big problems with that. One, it looked great before when you first compare, like this is Chrome using CSS Grid, this is IE using Flexbox, and it looks 1-to-1. But when you add more items and have scroll bars, the browsers have different definitions of what 100 VW is. And so like Chrome thinks that scroll bars don't count in the VW count. IE thinks it does, and so it doesn't scale things smaller. It's a huge problem to a point where we had to hide overflow horizontal scroll. And also, it was really terrible when all of a sudden products came back with feedback asking how they're supposed to make sidebars that come in and out. So because we were using VW units, which are absolute units, for you to have a sidebar come in, you'd have to say, okay, the sidebar's coming in. It's going to be 4 columns wide. All of the content that was taking the full screen, maybe the full 12 columns, now you only have 8 columns, and you need to readjust how many columns you're taking now. It would have been a lot better if we had relative units. So after it died down, I was done with working on design system stuff. I started thinking about the problem, it really irked me. I was like, man, how would I do that with relative percentage units? If I had percentage units, then I knew that if I brought in a sidebar, this div would see the sidebar and make room for it, but still maintain all the columns the design system gave it. And I started thinking, well, what would I do differently if I just started from scratch? And I realized I had been working a lot with side projects with Next.js and CSS and JavaScript solutions. And I realized, you know what? One thing just day to day I didn't enjoy doing so much was Sass, because I don't have a background in Sass. The only reason I was using Sass, honestly, was because a lot of IBM uses Sass, so it was helpful to hand something off that used the technology people were familiar with. But every time I wrote a for loop in Sass, I had to go back to documentation and look up what it was. And so I started polling the company. We have a huge front-end community. I was just asking them, like, okay, what do you use in your projects here at work? And what do you actually use in your personal projects? And I think Sass and Less have been awesome contributions to the community. They're definitely not going away anytime soon. But you know, more newer solutions come up. And the interesting thing about this quick survey was that all the other solutions actually grow when it comes to personal projects. And that doesn't mean they're better than Sass or Less, but what it tells me is eventually those things are going to grow even more in enterprise. Usually we adopt early in personal work and then put it in our enterprise work. So I was like, you know what? I use CSS-in-JS all the time on my personal projects. If I was to make an alternative to Gridish that wasn't tied to company needs and just making it on my personal time, I would totally use CSS-in-JS. The CSS-in-JS library I'm used to using is called styled components. If you haven't used it, it's really easy to take on if you know CSS, because all it boils down to is you have a template literal from JavaScript, and then it's just plain CSS inside. But then you can break out of the CSS anytime and back into JavaScript to get your props. So you would write out your styled component as a template literal, and then you would use that styled component anywhere in your React project, JSX, as if it was a React component itself, and it would render things like this. And you know, it's been like, what, 3 years now since the debate has gone back and forth about CSS-in-JS. I'm over it. I love CSS-in-JS. You don't have to love it. That's cool. But it definitely has made its footprint in enterprise now. So I started thinking, okay, well, if I wrote this entirely in JavaScript, I'd be heavily influenced by styled components. For starters, I would have a lot less parsing between things, and that's just mental overload the more I parse between languages. I'm really just replacing one scripting language with another scripting language. Sass and Less are scripting languages that were built around to handle CSS as best as possible. And then finally, I really liked the idea of how weird in projects you could get using something that was written in isomorphic JavaScript. And we'll see why in a second. So I ended up coming up with a new tool. It's called GridWiz. It wasn't hard to make. It didn't take that long because really I was just doing the exact same thing I did with Gridish in a different language. But I had learned my lesson about absolute units. So we have subgrid just like Gridish, but it's using percentage, so we don't have the scroll bar problems. Say that 5 times fast, and we don't have any sidebar problems either. It's a lot more flexible. I wanted to get more detailed in the progressive enhancement. So instead of saying here's your modern file, here's your legacy file, I actually added a attribute in the config called support. And support is you telling it, hey, I want browsers that support this CSS feature. So right now there's 3 support modes. There's display flexbox, CSS variables, and display grid. Eventually when level 2 starts rolling out of CSS grid, we'll have a 4th one. But what we get between these support modes is we get more browser support versus less code for performance. And it's really helpful to just see a chart and say, you know what? I only need to support browsers that support CSS variables, so I can be in the middle. I have a little bit more code, but a lot more browser support, or be on one of the tail ends. And then finally, the flexible environment is what I'm excited to share with you. It may not affect you too much day to day, but I think it'd be cool to show. So yell at me if I need to zoom in more. But I just want to show you some source code first. Got him? Okay. So literally, like, the source code of GridWiz is just like functions calling each other, importing, exporting. And then they're all just like returning these template literals. And I'm able to hold variables by staying in the JavaScript. And then I can actually just use dot maps and dot filters just like we enjoy in ES6 land, ES6, ES 2015, 16, whatever. The only thing I don't like about this is dev tooling's not really there yet. So like you notice the syntax highlighting's not beautiful. That can get confusing at times. But the output's really fun because I'm writing JavaScript that will work both on the client's browser and on a server. And so why that's cool is if we go to the demo website, is that pretty clear? You can see I actually have a config right here on the side. And if we scroll down, you can see, okay, here's my breakpoints. I have 4 columns on small breakpoint, 8 on a medium, 16 on a large, and so on. But you know, if I wanted to change that, say on small, I actually only wanted 2 columns. You saw it update live. And what's happening is I'm actually re-rendering all the CSS for that grid framework anytime I want on the client side. And so this becomes a fun live demo where you can sit with a designer and actually design your grid together. And I can change the prefix. Say I called it the Kirby grid. I don't know why I would do that unless I was alluding to something in the future of this presentation. But then we start getting a preview of like how much code am I actually generating here. Say it says right now, hey, this is a 21 kilobyte size of CSS, but gzipped it's 4 kilobytes. And then we start wrestling with what's our performance budget. And so you can actually turn things off. So say I didn't want subgrid. Then all of a sudden my file size changed a bunch. I'm going to put that back to true because I love subgrid and you're not going to enjoy CSS grid without it. So right now we're in display grid, which is the most performant option file size wise. But if I wanted flexbox, I'd go display flex. If I wanted to be in the middle, I'd say CS variables. But you can see when I switch to flexbox, bam, it's like the largest size it could possibly be. And then final ooh moment is I can just copy and paste all the code if I wanted to. Because it's isomorphic JavaScript, you could just use this website, copy and paste the code wherever you needed to. Or you could set up a build process. Say you're on a design system team. You set up your own repo to distribute your company's grid, and you would import this as a node dependency, and you'd have a node script that compiles the grid code, and then you would distribute it on NPM, or maybe you could even render it on the server. I don't know. And then if we scroll down, we see that we have subgrid ability. So the green is the parent divs, the purples are child divs. We have your typical offset, like if you use Bootstrap grid, used to something like that. You can hide things starting at certain breakpoints if you just use 0 columns, which is actually display none, so it's actually accessible instead of visually hiding it. And then just switch over to the documentation whenever you have a question or need to look at browser support modes and which browsers you can support. So that's GridWiz. You can use it today. It is not as popular as Gridish because it didn't have the IBM name on it, and it was the second one to do the same job. But it has 0 issues on GitHub. So right now I'm calling it flawless. That's probably a bad challenge to give you though. So yeah, that's GridWiz. And now I want to switch gears. Last week I was thinking about, okay, well, if I was a developer, a user of GridWiz, what would be the best way for me to deliver that to my users? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a Next.js React app. If you haven't heard of Next.js, it's a very minimal framework over React to provide isomorphic apps. So when a user requests a page, it's going to render everything it can on the server, send a static HTML file with all of the UI already in it, and then it'll download some JavaScript to take over and make it like a client-side app like you're usually used to using if you use React, Vue, or Angular. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this repo looks like. So Next.js doesn't have many opinions about how you can do things, but it does insist that you have a pages folder where all your routes are. So each of these is actually a page on this website. I made some data. To prove when our grid is working, I made these arrays, and what they are, they're actually pixel data to make up a sprite of Kirby. I've been playing too much Smash Brothers lately. And I'm not really going to use the full power of CSS Grid. I'm not going to position things on specific rows. I'm just going to have them keep wrapping, because I'm not trying to show off CSS Grid to you. I'm showing off the best way I could think of how to use it. And then this is going to be the config for GridWiz. I actually just copy and pasted the same 16-column breakpoint multiple times to blow up the file size so we could see the different set points. So what this ends up making is GridWiz performance test. And that's our grid in action. If I inspect this, each stretch of colors is actually a div, and I'm on a set interval right now where the DOM's actually being updated with React. Shoot me, I know. This would not make any architect happy. I'm not going to have it animated in our actual test, but I am going to have 4 different tests. And these 4 different tests are going to try to deliver the grid CSS in unique ways. One thing that's cool, since I already have server-side rendering of the UI and all the styles that are not the grid, we'll be able to isolate to just seeing the performance differences in the grid. Show of hands, who thinks I should do this live? Thank you. So if my results are different than what I expect, it's your fault. So the first way I'm going to do things is just like old school website, how we're used to delivering CSS every day. An HTML file comes down to the user requested a website. A document file comes down, which is the HTML. And then that HTML file on the browser says, hey, I need this CSS file. So it asks the server for a CSS file, and then it comes back down. So, yeah, I should. Well, I'm going to have to open up DevTools anyways. OK, so we have a static Kirby. The Kirby taking its shape means we have a grid. I'm going to go over to the Network tab. I do not have any service workers. I've disabled cache. And I can't do this while offline. I'm going to be on slow 3G. Slowest preset Google gives you. It's like we're back in, what, 2014? So I'm going to request this page from scratch. And we don't even need to look at we don't even need to look at frames. We just need to look at when these files came in. So let me zoom in. OK. All right. So static CSS is the name of the web page. This is the HTML and all of the styles that are not the GridWiz styles. So that took 2 seconds to come down to the user. But then this is the actual GridWiz styles being brought down. And we can see it ends at this blue line. So if we add the time it took for the page request to finish and the time it took for the CSS file to finish, that total time gives us how long did it take from the user request a page to them having a page with all the styles. So we do a little calculus here. And it's around 4.8 seconds, which is honestly pretty close to what I had. Ah! There we go. I'm like, OK. I'm going to keep switching in between these two. So next, I'm going to try to deliver the grid CSS in the exact same way I'm delivering all the rest of the styles. I'm going to generate this grid code when a user requests it on the server. And this is called server-side rendering. So if we look at the next page, what's happening is when a user requests this page, this is what's sent to it, including a CSS module called global style. I'm importing the GridWiz function, And it generates the styles on user request. So if we try that out. Oh, I forgot I'm still on slow 3G. Let me get to the home page. Okay. I'm going to switch back to slow 3G, and now I'm going to request that page. With this measurement, there will be no request that says .css. We're just going to look at the initial document page because that's when all the styles are delivered. All right. So, I got to actually do a hard refresh because this app is so smart. It just loads JavaScript if you're navigating in between pages. All right. So that was a huge improvement. If we're only measuring that initial document request, we're only looking at 2.23 seconds. And what this displays is how much each individual request costs if they're not concurrent. So that's a massive improvement over what we were doing. And I was really excited about this test result. I shared it with a coworker, and then they asked, well, yeah, but isn't that a load on your server? You're having every user request, the server having to remake the grid. Couldn't that actually delay it some? And so I thought, wow, that's actually probably true. And so the next test, we're going to actually deliver it in the exact same way, but we're going to have the CSS already generated during the build process of this website before we actually even deploy it. So if I go to static JS, you can see it's just a string of all that grid style, but it's pre-rendered. And so then we run that test. And then gonna emulate again, slow connection. All right, we actually just get 2.23 seconds. That was, I think, 100th of a second more. And so what that tells me is it's really just going to be in the same range. If I'm getting any cost out of not pre-rendering the CSS beforehand, all it is I'm putting more load on my server. That obviously scales with the amount of user requests you get. So this is going to help you in the long run once you're like Facebook and getting millions of requests at once. Hopefully, as Texas back yet gets to that status at some point. So finally, I was like, okay, I know the fastest way to deliver styles is probably what every CS major in here is saying, well, DOI, it's just sending it in the initial request, server-side rendering it. But I started thinking, okay, well, if a user is requesting something, what if I knew what browser they were requesting? Because I have this really small CSS grid file, and then I have this really big CSS flexbox file. And I was like, man, if I'm the first person to think of this, I'm going to be a pioneer in this industry. But I wasn't at all, of course. Anybody know what that's called? Where the server finds out which browser and delivers to different browsers different content? Yeah, sniffing. It's called user agent sniffing. So that's what our fourth page does. MDN has an article on user agent sniffing, and there's multiple warnings to not do it, but we're going to do it.
Very user agent tag?
What's that?
Do you also supply like the very user agent in the responses for HTTP?
I do not know. So the way I'm going to get the user agent data, so it's already included in the request.
Right.
I have a node server going on, and it's using Express for the routing. I'm just going to add some middleware. It's called Express User Agent, very brandable. And it's just going to parse the user agent data and just give it a more cleaner object format where I can just say, hey, is this Chrome? Is this Firefox? What version of Firefox? The biggest warning against user agent sniffing in a lot of articles is you don't want to rely on it. And so what you're going to notice is my user agent sniffing is pretty safe. So get initial props is a function that Next.js adds to React. It's anything you do in there is actually happening on the server side when the page requests. And it provides you the request object just like if you were in your Express server. So now I'm getting all of this data from the user agent. And I had that table, if you remember, where I know exactly which versions support which CSS features. By default, I'm going to give everyone the Flexbox grid code because I want to play it safe. I don't want to mess people up and try to give them something their browser may not support. But if they support CSS variables, let's give them the CSS variables version instead. And if they support display grid, let's give them that version instead. And so we get to go from smaller and smaller files. So if we run that, we're going to go back to the home page. And then we're going to make sure we emulate again. And oh, this isn't going to work unless it's a hard refresh because Next.js is so smart. All right. And we should save the same result I got when I was testing this before. We save 0.10 of a second. You're welcome, America. And so what did we learn? That we did save some, but really the biggest factor in how long it takes is how many requests are you doing not concurrently. And that's something you'll not learn just from delivering CSS. You'll learn it from delivering anything the more you work on performance on a product. What is really nice about this, though, this user agent sniffing, is the biggest performance gain we get is for these modern browsers versus older browsers. So this is actually a side-by-side of Chrome and then browser stack running, is this IE or Edge? I think this is IE. Yeah, that's IE 11. And what we notice is that this one's taking way longer because it's delivering the Flexbox version of the grid. But this one actually, I can inspect it. We go into the header tag. Let's just look at the CSS. If I can find it. Here, I'll just inspect elements. I'll inspect our Kirby. Let's look inside you, Kirby. You can see this is the display grid dev tools showing up to show us our alignment. So we know we're using like a 20 kilobyte file versus the 100 kilobyte file for the older browsers. So what we learned from this, nothing's better than less requests. And then we can get extra savings and be user agent sniffing if we're very safe. This also not only helped me with feature support in different browsers, but Edge actually can't use the display grid version of the GridWiz right now because there's been an outstanding bug from October where they do not render correctly CSS grid rules that have calc functions with CSS variables inside of them. And if you look up that bug, I'm the only one in there asking, hey, did you fix this yet? Did you fix this yet? You fixed this yet? But you can use GridWiz today in any of the other browser support modes and serve Edge users, the older ones, if you do want to use CSS grid. And once subgrid level 2 spec comes out, released to modern browsers, then the file size is only going to get smaller. If anything, if you took anything away from this, I hope you know that I totally over-engineered this. But also it's a good just reminder of how the web works. We went over the grid tools that are available today, and we looked at the most performant and user-centered way to do that. There's 2 parting gifts I'd like to remind you about. One I already told you about was GridWiz. Use it today. Figure out how not flawless it is for me because I'm only speaking to myself in a mirror and I think it's perfect. And then also to make the test, I actually used a boilerplate that we just released today here at Pingboard, not here, across the river, at Pingboard. It's called Next.js PWA, Progressive Web App Boilerplate. And if you use that boilerplate over any of the other boilerplates, the difference is if you use it correctly, it'll give you a perfect Google Lighthouse score immediately starting off. So you can go ahead and use that today if you want. If you don't, I'll cry. But thank you so much. Are there any questions?
Hope so.
Questions, anyone from the audience?
Yeah.
From Anton?
Hey, Anton.
Hi. Do you know if other prefixes and post CSS can kind of polyfill it sort of for your IE11?
Yeah, and the thing I was avoiding with this example was preprocessors. I was trying to avoid, and then the pre-rendering was basically the same role as a preprocessor. So yeah, you absolutely can. It's another way to go.
Okay. So this is just for like CSS-in-JS?
Yeah, the problem you're going to have with post-CSS implementation to polyfill is the auto placement. Mm-hmm. Literally, what IE11 and any of those old browser versions will do if they do not have everything exactly placed where they want, they just place them on top of each other.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, Curtis.
I might have missed it, but how did you pixelate Kirby to get him into the grid?
I wasted Sunday night instead of actually working on the content of this presentation.
You asked the same question I was too ashamed to ask because I thought I was using up our time on something.
Yeah, so
That's cool.
the way I would have done this if I did it properly was I would have said, okay, there's a black stretch on this column, this many rows long, and put in the CSS grid rule specifying that. All this is just an array. It says how long an item is and what color it may be if not transparent. So if we look at a Kirby component, I'm just mapping. So here's where I use a class name from GridWiz I generated. And then I'm just mapping this pixel component. Something I wish CSS Grid had also was aspect ratio sized rows. Aspect ratios are a CSS unit being worked on, but we don't have them yet. So thanks to the magic of CSS and JavaScript, if each of these pixel components knows how many rows it is, I can calculate how tall the aspect ratio should be. So each pixel component, actually, it's just a styled component, no React, but it's just doing this math in a pseudo element. And if you've ever had to make an aspect ratio on the web, you've probably used this hack with pseudo elements before to make something the perfect aspect ratio responsively. It's where you use an after element and then you use padding bottom to push it to the height it's supposed to be. Yeah, cool. Anything else? Great. Please break GridWiz. Let me know if you have practical use in enterprise. If not, just definitely explore server-side rendering solutions. We knew back when PHP was the bee's knees that server-side rendering was great, but it's only even better now in modern JavaScript environments because now with CSS and JavaScript, when a user requests a page, that page knows which components it uses. Those components know which styled components they use, or CSS and JavaScript parts, which means they know exactly which rules, CSS rules, they need to deliver to the user in that initial document request. Thanks.
All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Let's call it a 7-minute break, and come back at 8:45, and we can chat a little bit more before we head out.
Cool.
Good job, man. You crushed it.
Thank you. Thank y'all.
That's great.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
So it's a little after 8:45. We've got time for a few more questions for James, if anybody has any of those, and then we can also just do any Any announcements or anything anybody wanted to talk about in the web? If you have a question about something or wanted to point something cool out that happened. Any more? Yes, Marie.
This is a super basic CSS grade question, but I haven't actually used CSS grade in any actual examples other than CSS Grid Garden, my favorite game ever. So what would be like some examples of like if I wanted to try using CSS grid or Gridish or grid without, what would be some example layouts that I could try using it with?
Yeah. So, hello. I mean, honestly, like do pixel art. Do it in a way smarter way than how I was doing with one array. Actually, like say, okay, this span of pixels is on this column, this row. That's a lot of fun. Make mosaics. If you're actually looking into product, I would actually just go to a product you admire and try making a lo-fi version of that. Just focusing on their actual layout and saying, okay, well, they have a text node, 2 text nodes that align here, but I can see that they're actually in different parent containers. How would I do that?
There was also, and for context, I probably know significantly less about Grid than the majority of people here. There was a good example floating around on Twitter that you might be able to search for today. It was someone made like a theater or a movie ticket with everything in like different directions and changing things up, and that was supposed to be a cool example that people were fawning over.
Yeah, lots of more cool artwork coming up.
Yeah, I've also seen a lot of, well, not a lot, but I've seen some good examples of just people taking traditional print. I saw a really cool example of someone taking a poster from the Bauhaus era and doing it in CSS Grid. So I think that's a good place to start too.
Yeah, check out Jen Simmons. She's one of the folks who I think helped shepherd Grid along for the past few years, and she has a history in print design. So I think she's been a really good voice in saying like, hey, the web's kind of falling behind on what it's capable of with regard to layouts, and she has a ton of advanced examples of just really powerful, cool grid layouts.
There's her and another British woman.
Rachel Andrew, or Andrews, I cannot remember which.
Both of their websites are awesome.
Can you like post links to those? Someone like share links to those?
We have a
Twitter?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm like, which one of us is? Oh man.
I need
Or
Is this the part where I like super plug our Slack that we don't have a sign up process for?
I'm not like I follow like those in JS like I don't follow it, but I like people.
How about this? Come to Lavaca Street Bar afterwards, and we'll all pull up the Twitter clients on our phones. Did I convince you?
You can actually still access the Twitter account from outside the bar, so you don't have to. We will tweet something out. Yeah, sure. We'll tweet some stuff out.
Thanks.
All right. Other questions?
What are you going to tweet out again?
Good question. Links to some CSS Grid examples, including.
Lawn social.
Wait, so do you have to go to a bar for that, or what was that?
No, I'm pretty sure that Twitter works outside the bar. But if you want to watch the magic happen, come to the bar. Okay, well, I've got a cool thing that I saw on Twitter. Cool, not cool, depending on your accessibility story. Apparently, the Ninth Circuit upheld a judgment against Domino's that says that the ADA applies to websites, which means that the accessibility landscape's about to shift, very likely about to shift dramatically in the next couple of years.
When was this?
Today, I think. It's on Twitter, so probably today.
Can you tweet that out too?
I retweeted it on my personal Twitter feed.
Okay. Well, I don't follow you.
I'm kidding. Is the moral to add accessibility as a skill on LinkedIn?
Yes, absolutely.
I think it means that you can actually ask for like time during a sprint for it now.
Leverage.
What?
You want to get sued?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so you don't even. So what the article was saying was that the next likely thing to happen is that insurers are going to raise their rates for large companies because if you're not WCAG 2.0 compliant, just in kind of holding out basically to account for the risk of the large judgment that might come out. So we should all be doing accessibility because it's the right thing to do, but now also it's going to be extremely expensive not to do that. So
Wait,
That's
so
good
how
news.
much will they fine?
I have no idea. A lot, I'm sure. Many pizzas.
Maybe it's probably easier to just pay the fine user in these cases.
That's not been my experience with accessibility judgments. Target takes accessibility very, very seriously now, and they were the first ones to lose one of these judgments. They, so far anyway, have crafted the judgments enough to really like hurt, not enough to like put the company out of business, but enough to make them change their behavior. So we'll see. You had some sort of update about a browser, something about a browser?
Oh yeah, I realize we normally talk about things that we, like exciting web things that have happened since the last time we met. We haven't met since November, you said, right? October. So yeah, we didn't discuss the big news about Microsoft Edge. Does anyone remember the big news about Microsoft Edge?
They're moving away from their own engine. They're using Chromium.
It was pretty quick. If you blinked, you might have missed it. That's the news.
So they're adopting Chrome's engine Blink, which is an old fork of WebKit, and they will also be using V8 Chrome and Node's JavaScript engine as well. And I believe they started on that work already. I think they said a few more months and there's going to be a preview about it. So the good news is, hey, browser compatibility. The bad news is, yeah, y'all were Google browser wars.
IE6. It's gonna be IE6 soon.
Yeah, there's way too many opinions on the subject, but if you want to read like half of Medium content from the month of December, just, Google Edge.
All right, any other announcements, questions? All right, well, thanks for coming, y'all. Let's thanks James again. Thank you, Magento, here, and thanks to Spreadfast for hosting us the penultimate Spreadfast Austin JS.